Welcome back, Toro students. I'm Mr. Martinez,
And I'm Miss Garcia.
and this is History Talks. If you don't remember, History Talks is those opportunities in our class in world history where we have pre-recorded lessons where all of our lectures are put together in a nice video where not only are you going to listen and learn by taking some small notes on the side, but you're going to follow along with the video's checkpoints where there'll be moments where the video will stop to make sure that you are actually learning before proceeding forward. So once again, there is not only the task of watching the video, but of course, taking some small notes, which you will see at the very end on what that looks like. So let's go ahead and introduce our topic that we have today, which is an exciting one. We have practiced so much in our class to set ourselves up for this topic, which is World War II, the beginning parts of it, as we see the Axis powers rise in this new world order. Let's go ahead and take a moment to see what are the standards, what are the essential questions, what are the things that we are looking out for when it comes to this. Our standard is to compare the German, Italian, and Japanese drives for empires in the 1930s, including the 1937 rape of Nanking, other atrocities in China, and the Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939. Our essential question, though, the thing that we are most trying to understand is our capability of tracing the course of these Axis powers, aggressions, and how the Allies resist. So not only are we going to watch how the Axis powers are going to make their first steps, but how the world is going to respond now that there is a full-out war. But we're using terminology in here, Axis powers, Allied powers. What does this mean, Ms. Garcia?
Well, boys and girls, as you may remember, the Axis powers formed when our fascist and totalitarian dictators decided to team up, and they made the Axis powers. Our key players are in Italy, we have Mussolini. In Germany, we have Adolf Hitler, and in Japan, we have Tojo. They are going to be against the Allied powers. In Britain, we have Winston Churchill, their prime minister. In the United States, we have Franklin D. Roosevelt, and we have Stalin from the Soviet Union. Now, something might seem fishy. Go ahead, Mr. Martinez.
Yeah, that guy to the far right, wasn't he a totalitarian? Isn't the Allies the good guys?
See, Stalin still is a totalitarian dictator, but he's a totalitarian dictator that the Allied powers are willing to work against. He's the lesser evil of the Axis powers. If you will remember earlier, he had a plan and he had linked up with Hitler, but Hitler double-crossed him. So now he's getting revenge with the Allied powers. But don't be confused. They do not like each other. They do not trust each other. But they are frenemies. They are willing to work with each other in order to beat the Axis powers.
So the only thing they have in common is their hate for Hitler, Mussolini, and the Axis powers. That's what brings you guys together.
Exactly. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Ain't that the truth?
All right, guys, so let's kind of preview where we're going to go. We have the Axis powers advance. World War II has started. It's going to start with the Nazi and Soviet invasion of Poland, followed by the London Blitz, the invasion of France and rescue at Dunkirk, Operation Barbarossa, the Battle of Leningrad, an attack on Pearl Harbor, and the continued Japanese invasion of the Pacific, ending with the United States declaring war on the Axis powers.
So let's begin in the beginning of this whole story, okay? Before Stalin is mad at Hitler, there is a time where they're both friends. They're in a relationship. They have created a team where they've decided not only to coordinate as friends, but to attack as friends as well on their enemies. So as you guys can see here, their very first step is a poor country that is in between these two giants, which is called Poland. Poland is in between Germany and Russia. And you're going to start to see those are the first places where World War II starts. In accordance with the Nazi-Soviet Pact, Germany and Soviet Union simultaneously attack Poland from the east and west. Within a month, Poland is no longer standing, and eventually is going to fall to these two enemies. The Western powers must defend their ally Poland. On September 1939, they declare war against the Axis powers. So as Poland is being invaded, Poland is reaching out to their Western democracy friends and saying, I'm about to be invaded from two different sides. What are you guys going to do now that they're actually using weapons against people? The best that the Western powers do is officially declare war and stopping the appeasement methods that we were seeing. Stalin and the Soviet troops, though, continue to invade Poland, even though with the announcement of the Western powers. You're going to see that there's a lot of different countries that are eaten up during this time, not only Poland, but a few other places that are called the Baltic states that are also going to be eaten up in Eastern Europe by the aggressions of the Soviets. So you can imagine how the Polish people felt as they only could withstand a month of being attacked from two different fronts from these two mighty militaries. When we talk significance, this is a big deal, not only because this is the official start of World War II. This is where you finally see Western powers put their foot down and say, okay, there is no way that we can work with Hitler now that he's officially attacking and cooperating with others like this. But it also shows the threat of these totalitarian regimes as it shows that level of cooperation. Dealing with one totalitarian regime is scary. Dealing with a team of them working together becomes a bigger issue that these Western powers are realizing.
All right, we're going to preview a short video about that invasion.
You can imagine how it felt for so many of those people as the announcement officially came out that World War II is starting and that everything is going to be put on pause for this intense global moment.
But we do advance, and the advancement is called Blitzkrieg. It's called Germany's Lightning War. The Blitzkrieg used tank and air power technology to strike a devastating blow against their enemy. The Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, bombed airfields, factories, towns, and cities. From the map up in the corner, you can see how from Germany, this is the orange down here, how they begin to use both their naval and air force in order to attack their neighbors to the north. After 1940, Hitler launched a blitzkrieg against Norway and Denmark, both of which soon fell. Next, his forces slammed into the Netherlands and Belgium. So within just a few short weeks, Hitler is able to enter into all of these northern territories. Germany uses military technology first experimented with in Spain to attack civilians. Now remember, we talked about this before. Spain and the Spanish Civil War are super significant because that's when we first start to see, number one, the buildup of the German military, which is going against the Treaty of Versailles, but we also begin to see their military advancement from First World War into now. Now they have more advanced military technology that some of their neighbors do not have. Additionally, we can see that they are able to both get to places by land and by sea. The significance of Germany's blitzkrieg is that Hitler is using a new military tactic, rushing your opponent when they are overwhelmed. This became so successful that it resulted in Europe under Hitler's control sooner than expected. People were not expecting to be invaded, and they were not being expecting to be overran so quickly. And this is one of Hitler's strengths, is that people are underestimating both him his military strategy, and the military might of the German army at this time. Here we're going to see the Nazis occupying Brussels. So we have a checkpoint for you guys. You guys are going to pause right here and reflect about what we just reviewed, what you read, and what you saw. What was the effect the Nazi-Soviet pact have on Eastern European nations? So again, you're going to want to consider, what did you read, what did you see, and what did we discuss in these last few slides in order to respond to the question, what effect did the Nazi-Soviet pact have on Eastern European nations?
Perfect. Thank you so much for responding to that. Let's go ahead and proceed forward in our lesson. Now that you've seen Hitler use this new method of blitzkrieg, rushing through Europe faster than expected, what happens to the Allied powers? What thoughts, what steps are they taking now that the war is officially started? Well, here's our next event, folks, that we're going to talk about. It's the rescue at Dunkirk and the invasion of France. The Nazis are going to proceed further through Europe and faster than the French and the British are ready to hold them back. They create this line of defense in this one region. Imagine that line where you start to see a lot of these Allied powers say, okay, if we create and focus our defenses on this one line right here, then Hitler will not get past it. They're going to find there's going to be lots of faults in that planning of creating this line of defense, especially with this blitzkrieg, which doesn't allow them to really build up that success of protection. And what's going to happen is the French and British are going to be overwhelmed. Their line starts to fall apart, and the Nazis pour through France and start to circle that platoon or that gathering of armies of British and French troops who were supposed to be the front lines against Hitler. What happens is they start to get pushed back all the way up onto France, up against this ocean right here called the English Channel. Right in here in the English Channel, you're going to see that the French and the British are now completely encircled, and they're put against the cliff, and they now are left to the Nazis. What happens is the Allied powers have to figure out, how do we save all of our soldiers who are left in Europe who are now being encircled by the Nazis? And this is a large number, 600,000 soldiers who were put on this encirclement. You start to see this great and really outstanding rescue that happens, where you have tons of English ships, both civilian and military, that are called by the governments to help out in a desperate attempt to save those British and French troops trapped by the German lines. And it becomes a really dicey rescue. You see it becoming very close as the Nazis start to push further, and you have these boats start trying to create a transport between Great Britain and France, trying to bring in every soldier possible before they are captured or killed. Believe it or not, it's somewhat successful, this rescue. They were able to get majority of the soldiers off of the mainland of Europe, but now it shows the final defeat as the Allied powers are losing their control of Europe. Their last group of soldiers being pushed so quickly out of Europe is now leaving Hitler to have full control of France and anything that follows. So what's the significance? The significance of this particular moment is first the fact of the miracle ending behind the rescue, even though of the aftermath of the defeat of the Western powers, but also the bad news of the fact that now Hitler has full control over Europe, with the last Allied powers resistance being pushed out.
And then here is a preview of what that looked like at the rescue of Dunkirk.
Wow. I always like to imagine what that experience could be like for the people who had to go through it. If you're thinking just in that time period of history, what it was like to be that British soldier stuck on that beach, not knowing the end of the story, you would feel very hopeless, right? You would feel that you were overwhelmed and losing to this evil force that is succeeding and taking over Europe. And I can imagine how those British soldiers must have felt being in that moment of trying to be the people who are supposed to stop this advancement, but at the end are the ones who need a desperate rescue from it.
So again, you guys are going to go ahead and pause here and you're going to reflect about what we shared with you and what you saw. Was the Manoir line effective? Why or why not? And again, remember the Manoir line is the fictional line that separates France and Germany. It's what originally kept them separated and what the French were counting on to keep the Germans out of France. Your task right now is to answer the question. Was it effective? Why or why not?
Perfect. Thank you so much for responding.
So the next advancement is England survives the London Blitz. So now we know that Germany has invaded their neighbors to the north, in the Netherlands and Belgium. We also know that they have invaded Poland to the east, and they have invaded France to the west. What lays before them is England. In September of 1940, the German Luftwaffe, or their air force, begins to bomb England for 57 days straight, days and nights, then periodically until the next spring. So for almost 60 days, almost 3 months, 2 months, they're bombing them constantly. And up until the next year, they're bombing them all day, every day long. In London, the government and citizens continued with their lives in constant bombardment. Now, a bombardment sounds like what it reads. They're getting bombed all day long. They are seeking safety in underground shelters. They have them in their homes, they have them in the city. You'll hear a large air raid, and then the people will pause whatever it is that they're doing, whether they're at their grocery store, they're at work, or at home. They will go into these bunkers, and then they will wait until the bombing is over. It's similar to what we have here in the States when people have storm shelters or tornado shelters. They hear an alarm go off and then they just stop whatever they're doing and they rush there for safety. Same exact thing, only instead of weather, they are trying to escape the bombing from the German Luftwaffe. Unfortunately, thousands are killed or injured, and much of London is physically destroyed. Buildings, hospitals, schools, governments, everywhere that you go, a majority of the buildings have been destroyed by the bombings. Germany was unsuccessful, however, in capturing England, and the British morale continued through the bombings. So in the map, you can see here that although Germany is much closer to England, they do use that advancement into France in order to send their Luftwaffe, their German Air Force, over England. Now, unlike over here in the States, where our neighboring countries are a lot farther away, we're buffered between Canada and Mexico. In Europe, all of those countries are significantly closer to each other. So it's much easier for them to fly from one country and back and forth and bomb their neighbors. Mm-hmm. The significance is that England during the London Blitz was the last nation standing against Nazi invasion in Europe, the last ones. Everywhere else has fallen to fascist control under the Germans, or they're under the control of the Soviets under communism. After a series of brutal bombings, England didn't surrender. So England is the last one holding on against the German Nazis. Let's go ahead into our next slide and we can see a little bit more about what the bombing looked like. Let's see what that looked like.
Wow. I think it's crazy how devastating this bombarding could have been. Day and night. When do you sleep? When do you rest? When do you recover as a society that's being bombed? And I think that was the main goal of Hitler, was to destroy the morale of the last Western democracy. If they could take this one, a lot of the world thought it would be all over for the rest of the world, as this was like the last spot that Hitler needed to take for full control of that hemisphere. Now, let's go ahead and answer the question right here for our checkpoint. How did London react to the Blitz bombardment? How did they respond? How did they react? How did they get through that moment? Please reflect back on the lesson you just learned and answer this question. Perfect. Thanks so much for that. But with the failure of England, it did not stop the ambitions of Hitler. It instead changed his focus. Hitler started to turn his attention back to what he was at his time, his friend, the Soviet Union. But if you remember from our previous lesson, just because they were both totalitarian regimes, they have different ways of handling things, different thinkings and ideologies behind them. So even though Hitler is close to Stalin, he does not like communism and would rather have that land and that terrain for Germany itself. So Germany is going to break the Nazi-Soviet pact in June of 1941 and initiate an intense operation of invading Russia in something called the Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's justification for his double cross was simply his need for more living space for Germans and to win control of a lot of the region's rich resources, especially when it came to the Baltic states and all the oil resources that would help with his military. The ultimate goal was to crush communism, take that land, and to continue further the German agenda. And what happens is another classic example of blitzkrieg, but this becomes the largest assault ever done in world history. It is widespread. As you see from this picture right here, it's not just one part of Russia that starts to become invaded. It is the entire line that is connected to Europe. A full-on assault, simultaneously attacking all at the same time. Now, this is an ambitious move. Russia is not an easy place to invade. Ask Napoleon. It does not go well. But Hitler is insisting that with his blitzkrieg, with his technology and his soldiers, he plans on invading Russia before the next winter comes through. He's going to try to start in spring and try to finish before the end of summer. But we're going to see that somewhere in that plan, it falls short. And this is one of those moments in history where a lot of historians question Hitler's moves and said, if Hitler did not invade the Soviet Union and made this mistake, would he have lost at the end? I think that's a big one that a lot of people still puzzle on. Let's go ahead and see what that Operation Barbarossa looks like. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching that video. For this being the largest assault in our human history comes the largest casualties we're going to see from this assault on the Soviet Union. Quick checkpoint, though. For what purpose did Hitler break the Nazi-Soviet pact? They were friends, but now they're enemies. What was Hitler's purpose for breaking his pact with Stalin? Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. Let's go ahead and continue with our lessons.
Next, we have the Battle of Leningrad. So we know that Stalin and Hitler are no longer working together. Hitler has broken the Nazi-Soviet pact. He's going to continue to force German troops into the Soviet Union. The German military breaches the Soviet border and is attempting to siege the capital of Leningrad, that is in northern Soviet Union. For 2.5 years, the Germans surrounded the Soviet capital. Soviets in Leningrad were forced to ration food to 2 pieces of bread a day. That's per person, only 2 pieces of bread. This is how bad things got. People began to boil and eat their wallpaper because they believed that it contained potato flour. You have to remember, the Germans have invaded their entire city. They're surrounded. They have no access to the resources that they would have used to keep them sustained. The conditions in Leningrad are horrible as they are forced to endure 2 harsh winters without any resources. And you have to remember, this is Russia. It's cold. Everything's frozen. They can't DoorDash anything. They're used to being able to leave their city to farm and get resources. They aren't able to do that with the Germans surrounding them. Unfortunately, more than 1 million Soviet civilians died. Stalin reaches out to British leader Winston Churchill, and they agree to work together. This is one of the beginning steps of the Allied powers working with Stalin, even though he is a totalitarian dictator, even though he is a communist. Stalin needs the Allied powers, and the Allied powers need Stalin. The significance of the Battle of Leningrad became a turning point in the Nazis' invasion of the USSR. The Nazi forces never recovered from their heavy loss and started losing the Eastern Front. Let's take a brief look at what that was like for them.
Wow. 1 million civilian lives lost in that siege. And a siege is simply just saying that the enemy is surrounding you and just waiting for you to give up by starving or by the bombardment. And for those people to survive, that must have been crazy. Let's go ahead and do our checkpoint real quick. Why was the Battle of Leningrad so difficult for the Soviets? Why was it so important? And also, why was it so difficult? Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Let's continue our lesson. We must acknowledge that World War II is not a Europe exclusive thing. It becomes a global conflict. And that's especially true with the actions of another totalitarian regime in the Pacific, making lots of advancements. We're going to talk about what are some of those actions that take place in the Pacific theater within this whole story of World War II. Some of them we already have talked about, but we're going to acknowledge it, going with the attack of Pearl Harbor, talking about how much the Japanese have taken within the Pacific, and the United States now becoming involved in this war. So if you can't recall, we've talked about Japan, we've talked about this totalitarian regime that pops up, and it is like Germany and Italy with its imperialistic motives that are driven by this ultra-nationalism and this sense of racial superiority. Like the Germans, they have that same feeling that they are entitled to more land for their people. Additional imperialism motives is essentially to expand their empire, to have more resources outside of their island, the ability to compete with Western democracies, for them to take them seriously, and for them to modernize Asia and the Asian territories so that it is closer to what has been the developments within Europe and elsewhere. With this whole push in Japan's imperialistic quest, they're going to be eating up a lot of these different islands and different places within Pacific and Asia. As you guys can see from that map, we talked and have acknowledged how China, Manchuria, and all these others are going to be eaten up by Japan, but also these small islands that are further reaching towards United States, which will inevitably leave us to the scene of Pearl Harbor. As you guys can see from that video, the Japanese empire is definitely creeping and spreading. And it starts to compete with a lot of different territories and nations that had ownerships within that area. Like I said, though, this is leading up to what we call the attack of Pearl Harbor, which brings United States officially within World War II. Now, the attack of Pearl Harbor is a surprise attack. This happens on December 7th, 1941, when you have an army of naval ships with warplanes that flew 4,000 miles across the ocean to reach a naval base we had on an island in Hawaii and bomb and destroy our naval fleet that we had within the Pacific. And they demolished what was there, folks. I'm talking 20 ships, 300 planes that resulted in 2,403 people killed and 1,000 wounded. It takes out the whole naval system that we had within the Pacific that we then had to rebuild. And this reawakens United States into being involved within Europe. At this entire time, United States was on the sidelines playing neutral still, even though Europe was being invaded. But after Pearl Harbor, it becomes too close to home, where now United States feels like they must act in this global war and finally end their isolationism that they were holding on to. Let's go ahead and take a look at that devastation of Pearl Harbor in our next videos. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching our clips and capturing a couple of the things that we're learning and seeing how in motion picture they try to capture it, or even within real footage, some of these historical events. But quick checkpoint for you. How is the attack on Pearl Harbor significant to increasing the global conflict? What makes Pearl Harbor significant within the story of World War II? Answer that real quick for us. Awesome. Thank you so much. And congratulations. You just finished another episode of History Talks. Now, there is a few different things that were also expected during today's episode that we're now going to go ahead and explain.
For today's assessment, we were going to want you guys to do a few things. The first thing is review the content that we covered in the History Talk. You can go back and rewatch this video or any of the videos that were linked in it. And what you're going to do is you're going to summarize each of the attacks by the Axis powers. We're going to want you guys to identify and explain the significance of each of the attacks. And if you guys are paying attention, you'll understand just how easy that is for you to do for this activity. You'll notice that you're going to have a slide that looks just like this, and it's going to have listed for you each one of the attacks or aggressions by the Axis powers, including the invasion of Poland, Operation Blitzkrieg, Dunkirk, the London Blitz, Operation Barbarossa, the Siege of Leningrad, and alas, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Two things you're going to be doing again is you're going to summarize in your own words, not Google's words, your own words, the event, and you're going to tell us what is the outcome or significance of each of those events.
Perfect. And after you fill out this graphic organizer, there is one last thing that we're going to ask out of you, which is a discussion board. You guys will have a quick discussion board, which out of all these different events you just learned, which battle stands out to you and why? What makes that battle so significant overall to you or within our story of World War II? Pick one and just tell us a little bit more why you chose it. But besides that, ladies and gentlemen, you are officially done with that history talk once you have taken those notes and shared a few things that you've learned. But this isn't the end of our story of World War II. This is just the beginning. There's so much more that we will discuss in our next episode. But until then, that is it for today. Thank you so much for being here, and make sure you do turn in your work properly. I'm Mr. Martinez.
I'm Ms. Garcia.
And this is us signing off. Thank you guys, and have a good day.